There is a question that sits underneath every conversation we are in this season. How does this keep happening? Not why people suffer. History offers too many answers to that, but how in a world with international courts, human rights law, congressional oversight mechanisms, and First Amendment protections? The architecture of accountability seems to bend so consistently away from the people it was built to protect. Noura Erakat is one of the most important legal scholars writing on Palestinian rights and international humanitarian law. Her book, Justice for Some, is the most rigorous account we have of how law has been used against Palestinian rights rather than in their defense. Lara Friedman has tracked U.S. congressional dynamics around Israel-Palestine more closely than almost anyone else. She has also documented in granular and authoritative detail what may be the most consequential domestic legal story of this moment: the systematic legislative effort to redefine anti-Semitism in ways that suppress Palestinian rights advocacy, silence campus speech, and threaten the tax-exempt status of civil society organizations. I want to understand the architecture of what has been permitted to happen. I want to understand what law can do and what it cannot. And I want to understand honestly whether there is any realistic path to accountability. Thank you both for joining me this morning. It is an honor to have you on this episode of Witness. To begin with, both of you have spent years examining the distance between what institutions promise and what they actually deliver. What was the genesis of the draw for you to this work? And Noura, I'd like to begin with you.
Thank you, Marium. Thank you for having me alongside Lara, who I have collaborated with, but also grown with across the years. And so I think that that's been the greatest indication of how much change we're experiencing personally and in the world, which is, as Octavia Butler reminds us, the only thing that stays the same. And thank you, Marium, for your efforts here. I love your framing of this as bearing witness and us providing that testimony. I understand your question in two parts. One is the attraction right into the lion's den of confronting power, and the other one of the work on Palestine. So I'll answer both somewhat briefly. I'm Palestinian. I'm born in the United States as a first-generation immigrant where English is my second language, and I'm first politicized as a girl in the world. I have three brothers in a Muslim Palestinian household, and it was through the lens of being a girl in the world and words I didn't know to give it, like feminism, that allow me to see the inequality and the way that we were constantly told that some things are just natural or meant to be, that I knew very much we had constructed as humans. And it was that lens that then enabled me to understand myself as Palestinian, to see what Palestine was, to even understand racism, poverty, and so on. And by the time I got to college, I was absolutely committed to a lifetime of advocacy and struggle. But my commitment to Palestine in particular didn't happen until after my first semester as an undergrad at Berkeley, when I actually white lied to my family and used a scholarship that I had received for academics to travel to Palestine and volunteer in Dahish, a refugee camp. As immigrants, the last thing they wanted from me is to go back to Palestine. The vision for most immigrants is you come, you do great in all of your wealth and success, you offer something to Palestine, but you never go back. And so on that trip, I was able to see the disparities, not just between Palestinians and Zionist settler sovereigns, but also to see the difference internally among Palestinians, class, racial, and otherwise. And when I got back to university, I looked around and thought, there's a lot of people working on all the other issues I deeply, deeply care about. I'd always seen the world as interconnected, but I also looked around and thought, my goodness, there's so few doing this on Palestine. We're the ones we've been waiting for. And so stepped into that. In terms of why then step up to confront power, it's been iterative. I begin as an organizer, grassroots organizer, first and foremost. Launching the divestment campaign at Berkeley, the first one on the second election of Ariel Sharon, February 6, 2001. I had been studying at Hebrew U. The second Intifada starts. I'm forced to leave. I come back to Berkeley, and with the first SJP, which had been established there in 1998, in fact, we then launched this divestment campaign. And so I started as an organizer. I finished law school and still planned my first job to sue Israeli officials and to plant BDS campaigns around the country. It was a two-part job. So we planted seeds at Stanford. We planted seeds with the Presbyterian Church USA. We were going against Caterpillar in the shareholder meetings. I'm an organizer at the same time that I'm working in the law, all of this is iterative. Before I throw myself directly into the work and work in Congress and then work within the UN system and human rights advocacy, all of it is iterative until I hit a wall that basically I need to answer the question, why is the law not working? What is the relationship between law and power? That drives me back to the academy. And here I am trying to do this work where I think I rely most heavily on people power and political work and grassroots organizing. It's bottom up for me all the time, first and foremost. That's power. And I do feel that how we then alter the structures of power really depends on how we've organized ourselves locally and grassroots wise, including in the law, at the UN, in our legislative work.
I have follow-up questions to how you've presented the answer to that, but hopefully we'll go through them step by step. So, Lara, turning it over to you, how would you describe your genesis?
Thanks. And I want to echo Nora's appreciation for this interview and the framing around witness. And I will say that I am deeply humbled to be on here with Nora, who is one of my intellectual heroes and teachers throughout my process of getting to where I am today. I'm going to steal Nora's framing because it's so brilliant on the first why Palestine and then why stepping up. My story is really also undergraduate story. I never really thought about Palestine very much. I'm Jewish American. I came from, I think, what is a very typically sort of conventionally Zionist home, which is we weren't really Zionists. We didn't really talk about it, but it was a default kind of course, we love Israel. Of course, I've got a Coca-Cola sign in Hebrew that somebody brought me back from Israel on my wall growing up. Never really thought about it. And I never really thought about the sort of narratives that I was taught, whether they were true or not. I just assumed they were until really I got to undergrad. Most important thing in undergrad, and this is why people who want to teach their kids to not challenge orthodoxy really don't want their kids to meet anyone else who doesn't agree with them. I went to a big school, University of Arizona, that's where I'm from, and I immediately met people from all over the world, including a lot of Lebanese. It was during the Lebanon Civil War, and a lot of Palestinians. And I discovered very quickly, mostly arguing with people over games of pool, that I didn't actually know enough about anything to defend what I thought I believed and what I thought I knew. And that was intellectually deeply dissatisfying. I grew up in a family where I was taught that our values and our intellectual integrity are key. Intellectual integrity is consistency and honesty and integrity. So that led me on a path of taking classes and learning a lot more. So that by the time I graduated and then went to graduate school, I had already moved a great distance away from knee-jerk sort of pro-Israel narratives that I grew up with. And then I joined the Foreign Service out of graduate school, and I went to Jerusalem on my first tour by accident. It wasn't my desire to become someone focused on the Middle East or Palestine. I'd actually intended to go to Africa. And in Jerusalem, I lived in East Jerusalem. All my neighbors are Palestinian. All my friends are Palestinian. It was just after the end of the First Intifada, and I spent all my days pretty much in the West Bank dealing with settlers and settlements. And it is a brutal reckoning to suddenly see things on the ground. For all the things I thought I knew, the reality of the West Bank, the reality of the IDF and how it treated me when I was in a car with Palestinian friends, or what we saw with settlers and settlements, and the friction doesn't even begin to describe it. And these are settlers who today are my contacts in the settlement movement. Then the ambassador to Washington was one of my contacts then when I was the consulate. And they were unabashed in their philosophy and in their dehumanization of Palestinians. It was a very steep and brutal learning curve for me, and it changed my entire interface with the world, because more than anything, it brought home to me not just the deep injustice, but the deep hypocrisy that pervades every conversation about Palestine. And it really brought home to me a sense of responsibility as someone who is Jewish, as someone who is American, for the role that we as Jewish Americans and the United States play in that. And that's sort of unbearable. Once you know that, you can't unknow that. So when I left the Foreign Service, I came back to this. And the question of iterative, when I came back into this after the Foreign Service, I came to the American arm of peace now, American sister organization to the Israeli peace movement, which is a liberal Zionist organization. And while I was there, and I think my friends in the broader movement who know me and have watched my evolution can attest, I really wrestled with the whole concept of liberal Zionism and trying to define it in a way that aligned with my views in a way that reflects integrity. And I remember once talking to an Israeli friend of mine and describing how I made my peace with the word Zionism, and his response was, well, that's great, and what you described is liberal, but it has nothing to do with Zionism. And I'm like, no, you're wrong. It's been a journey for me. Where I am today, I absolutely would not describe myself as a Zionist, and my focus really is on doing all I can to try to really achieve justice and integrity across the full range of policies and issues, which then takes me to stepping up and confronting power, which I like the idea of, again, iterative. When I came to Americans for Peace Now, I sort of dove in and started trying to look at all the legislation that existed, because I don't like to answer questions unless I really know all the facts. And that's when I started to realize there are so many inconsistencies in the current law. There's absolute outright hypocrisy in the way the law is interpreted and implemented. Things like anti-BDS legislation that started 2016 or so, and then the anti-Semitism legislation that started a few years later. I never set out to become the person who obsessively tracks these trends and documents them, but I kept getting questions about them, and I kept looking at articles and thinking, this is not being dealt with in a way that is accurate, and facts should matter. Law should matter. I know these normative statements about what should matter. It should. And at the very least, if I can't force people to make it matter, I can at least force them to face the hypocrisy of what they're saying. And I can empower the grassroots to have the facts they need to call out the lies when they see lies, and to call out the hypocrisy.
I want to take some of what Lara has said, Noura, and sort of flip the script, because a lot of how you answered the first question was anchored in your Palestinian Muslim identity. And I want to ask you, what unique value do you ascribe to our allyship with people like Lara, with their sincere and fierce outspokenness and advocacy for Palestine? Are they still outsiders looking in, or have they become so integrated that we are now one with them?
Great question. I was thinking about this as Lara was speaking, right? And I was thinking about how even at some point we were thinking about, in work that I had written about, how is it that we forge a shared and collective future? I've changed a lot, and I've changed a lot in the course of struggle and a long time ago to understand that this is just squarely and fundamentally a Palestinian liberation movement. That those who benefit from the supremacy of that structure and the privileges of that structure, the right to violence, the right to life of that structure, also have a lot at stake to become liberated from it. But it is not their liberation struggle. It is our collective liberation. But it is primarily a Palestinian liberation struggle, and one in which I think that our allies have to fundamentally understand themselves as allies, which means deference to Palestinian visions, strategies, tactics without dictation. And this is something that's come up a lot in movement, where those who want to be involved with Palestinians somehow want to then tell them, hey, we agree with everything that you say, but that slogan is just like a little bit too much. It's not up to you. You haven't endured this violence. If you feel like it's too much, it's because you haven't lived this, right? Or thinking in another way about all the times I've been on television or at universities or in communities where, in order to have me speak, I had to have someone who identified as Jewish or Israeli to speak alongside me so that they can rubber stamp what I'm saying. One, to make me a trustworthy interlocutor, but also two, what's suggested here is that what Palestinians want for their future has to be contingent on what might be amenable to would-be Israelis. Would be, because Jews who live all over the world have the ability to settle in Palestine and to acquire a citizenship through territorial accumulation, which is contingent on the dispossession of Palestinians. And here we are placed in a condition where that person has to explain that, go ahead, support the Palestinian because we're okay with that. Right? And what's the structure there is that, and this is what, similar maybe, Lara, to the way that your home was just by default Zionism. Zionism is so racist and supremacist as an ideology that it frames, without us even knowing, Jewish life as superior wherever it is, and Palestinian life as inferior. So that question actually matters. So that I, for example, can be on a television program on the day the first bombing of Palestinians in Rafah intense, where they are burned to death, where their skin melts off, where they're suffocated in plastic tents. And I'm talking about, a future without Zionism. And the host wants to ask me, but how does that make Jewish people feel? in the moment that Palestinians are being burnt to death. And so I just want to speak really, really plainly. We are all in a collective struggle for liberation. All of humanity is. But that has to be led by those who are at the greatest harm, even in human rights. Even if you take a very doctrinal human rights approach, there's a hierarchy to human rights. Territorial and bodily integrity are the top. Okay? Your feelings are the bottom. And so, in the vision, I still very much believe that we are in this to co-struggle. But I also think it's very important for us now to be able to separate, to extricate the Jewish question from the Palestinian question. Jews obviously have a question to settle about confronting anti-Semitism that cannot be wrapped up in Palestine, and that has preceded and has exceeded Zionism. But Zionism, at least since 1942 and the Biltmore Conference, has been the primary way that people have understood Jewish liberation, and that's the work here. We have to take it back to the Enlightenment. There's been unresolved questions about Enlightenment Europe and how that produced Jews as exogenous from the human. Let us resolve that question. Let us speak about, the externalization of Jews and the evacuation from them of European citizenship. Let's talk about it within a U.S. structure in Western society. But the imbrication of it somehow is tied to Palestine, and now we have to find a happy medium is not going to work. And we've witnessed this in the course of genocide. That should no longer be the answer. And it's incumbent on those of us really lead that call and to give folks the language and the confidence to be able to say what they feel. Because after you see genocide and you see an Israeli society that believes they have the right to do it and to do it again, right? Enough. That's when let's think about our collective humanity, using your language, Lara. Let us have integrity on how we approach that and defer to Palestinians in their liberation struggle.
Noura, let me follow up on that with two questions specifically, please. I'm going to ask them in tandem. So the first part of the question is that we know many Americans at this point have become hyper-focused about our democracy at the fault lines. Do you see a connection between the erosion of due process in student protest cases and immigration enforcement, and in the framing of even Iran policy? And if so, what is that connective tissue? That's my first question. My second question is, when you look at U.S. policy over the last 20 years, do you think it is more accurate to understand it as support for Israel, opposition to Palestinian self-determination, or something else entirely?
Let me answer the first question rather briefly, and it's something that came up a lot in the 2024 election, where folks were framing almost existentially. It's either Americans, and primarily Black Americans and other racialized communities who will survive, or Palestinians who will survive, right? Because the Biden administration had overseen a genocide, and so now this became, again, a mutually exclusive question about only one community can survive, and so we all have to, align behind a genocidal president in order to save ourselves. With zero irony, right? With zero irony, even though he was removed and there should have been another candidate. And obviously this was the moment to shift course, and polls showed us otherwise. And so I just want to say that in that moment, I think it was a missed opportunity and now we're seeing increasingly illuminated that the U.S.'s borders far exceed the continental United States and its, colonies, be it Hawaii, Puerto Rico, or otherwise. Our U.S. geography is global because of our militarism and imperialism and the wars that we wage abroad in order to enrich the United States, in order to maintain military superiority, in order to maintain some hegemony. I think that's crumbled even. That enrichment we take for granted in the United States because we can't see past our own borders. In fact, we can't even see within our borders. We don't understand the U.S. as a white settler colony, or the fact that there are indigenous people being removed, that the enrichment of so many is about white supremacy as a central organizing principle in the United States. And so here I just want to emphasize that state violence connects violence abroad and violence at home. They are imbricated. It's what Amy Césaire would describe as a boomerang, but even preceding that, we are basically producing that violence is co-constitutive. Julian Go, a sociologist at the University of Chicago, examined how the U.S.'s first imperial war beyond the U.S., when the U.S. defeats the Spanish in 1898 and comes to occupy the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico and all these Spanish holdings, that's when we see the U.S. military transform from a military that was protecting itself. For example, it might be defensive and engaging in expansion in the United States and, the American frontier, a settler frontier, to now one that needs to maintain its colonial holdings. And there we see the army transform to become racially profiling mounted units. That directly impacts the way that U.S. policing is then reformed in the early 20th century. So many people trace the militarization of U.S. police to the Vietnam War, but Go and others will show that it far, far precedes that moment. And so in this moment, there's no way to understand what's happening in the United States if you can't see what the United States is doing abroad. You just forgave Biden, but Biden and Trump the same. Expansion of police powers, lying under oath in front of congressional hearings, the dismissal of jobs, the weaponization of student protests, the infringement on academic freedom without understanding how people have given them a pass in Palestine and beyond. But I'm using Palestine here because genocide is so central. And so here I would just say state violence is entwined. And in order to be able to defeat fascism at home, we have to be able to defeat, at minimum, genocide abroad. And now we're seeing the future of that in the seeds for the BOP or the Board of Peace. On the second question, look, I think that the U.S. policy has been consistent since 1967. At the time of the mandate, at the end of the First World War, was seen as an alternative for the Palestinians, seen as an alternative to the British. By 1948, the U.S. is voting to recognize Israel, but is not an ally. And in 1967, the U.S. under Lyndon B. Johnson becomes the primary ally to Israel, providing it both its qualitative military edge, which means it could defeat singularly or collectively all of the Middle Eastern countries, and ensuring that it is beyond multilateral reach, meaning that international law will not impact it. And instead, the outcome will be determined by political negotiation only, which means power will prevail, which means if the U.S. is behind Israel, here we have U.S. global superpower supporting. It has been the policy since 1967. The things that have changed has been how honest or not U.S. administrations have been about this. I just want to be clear on this. What has changed is how the U.S. has been honest or not about this. That the Obama administration, for example, is seen as more favorable to the Trump administration on the question of Palestine, belies the fact that the Obama administration used its first veto in the Security Council against a resolution on the illegality of settlements. What's changed is public opinion. What's changed is that people have made their own decisions. Public opinion is unequivocal that there is far more support for Palestine. People understand Israel as a genocidal state, as one that acts outside of the bounds of international law in its war of aggression on Iran, for example, as its outright desire to settle its territorial ambitions in the south of Lebanon, as the circulation of its weapons globally, entwinements with U.S. police forces. People see Israel as a bad guy and a bad actor. It's cringe, so to speak. Young people refer to things that they think is cringe as so Israeli, right? There's a major cultural shift. That has changed. That has not translated into political power. But we see the 6 new pro-Palestinian candidates who have been elected in their primary elections. That too is changing.
Thank you, Noura. I also would like to ask Lara, in response to what Noura has shared, how do you carry what she has said? Is it entirely resonant for you? Are there areas that you would push back on?
Thank you. I always love listening to Noura. I feel like I come out smarter and more articulate just for listening to her. So, on the first question you asked, Noura, I agree with everything she said. Look, it is not the Palestinians' problem that Jewish people like me are wrestling with what being Jewish means in an era when Judaism is being redefined, or there's an effort to redefine it entirely in terms of a political project that I reject. That isn't Palestinians' problem. And to the extent that I want to do something about a project that is being done in my name that I disagree with, my role, and I've certainly evolved in how I think this role is best enacted, but my role is to be an ally, and it's to exploit the privilege that I have. And I recognize that I have privilege here, but it's to exploit it in order to do everything I can to strengthen, amplify, back up what Palestinians are doing, what Palestinian leadership of the movement wants to do, and not to tell people what they can and can't do. And I say this from also the painful experience looking back of being part of a very well-intentioned peace industry, which did exactly what Noura said. For years, if we wanted to organize an event where we had a Palestinian speaker, you also had to have a pro-Israel or Israeli speaker. You couldn't have a Palestinian voice just speaking. I was always uncomfortable with you shouldn't use this framing, but I think I was uncomfortable with it at the time, more of my argument being people keep telling you it's not effective, but what they're saying is more effective hasn't worked. The point is we shouldn't be telling Palestinians what to say, what language to use. But let's also be clear, all of the well-intentioned liberal Zionist framing that's been pushed on Palestinians for decades didn't work either. In fact, all it did was normalize a political paradigm that has kept Palestinians, a so-called peace paradigm, that's actually kept Palestinians shackled to occupation, to apartheid, and now to genocide. So, I mean, my goodness, grow some empathy. And grow some humility, as if you somehow think you're wiser than the people who actually are at the forefront of trying to fight genocide. Enough. I mean, it's been enough for a long time. In terms of how I behave in the world and the model that I try to give to other people in the sector who are maybe similar, is that embodies that as best as possible. And I know that I can rely on Palestinian allies and friends to tell me if I'm not, and I appreciate that. So there's that. I will say on the fighting anti-Semitism piece of it, this again goes to the question of it is not the problem of Palestinians to solve that there's rising anti-Semitism, most of it coming from the right, from the traditional sources that we all know. It is our problem to solve. And the fact that there is a political program that seeks to subvert an effort to fight actual anti-Semitism and turn it into a Zionist program to suppress and delegitimize and perhaps punish and criminalize Palestinian movement for lives and rights is outrageous. And again, that isn't Palestinians' problem, but it's always made Palestinians' problem because every time there's an effort at fighting anti-Semitism, like the IRA definition or even the more well-intentioned Jerusalem Declaration, these are well-intentioned efforts to not have the anti-Semitism fight turned into a cudgel against Palestinians. You still see it framed, like the whole idea that anti-Semitism needs to be understood and defined in any way in opposition to Palestinian language, Palestinian rights, Palestinian movement is ridiculous, and that has to be challenged. On the question of whether it's anti-Palestinian or pro-Israel, I would argue that in the post-67 era in which we all live, that is a distinction without a difference. If you listen to people in Congress, it's not just anti-Palestinian, it's anti-Arab, it's anti-Muslim. The language in Congress for my entire lifetime, the legislation, the resolutions, all of that, it is clear for political purposes, anything that humiliates, shows contempt for, sanctions, pick your word, Palestinians in particular, but also Muslims and also Arabs, is considered the pro-Israel place to be politically. It's completely indistinguishable. And the question of how this is changing and what Noura said about the sort of evolution to Obama and where we are today, I mean, I did an analysis during the Obama era about UN Security Council vetoes and UN Security Council resolutions. People think Obama, the most pro-Palestine president, Obama vetoed everything related to Palestine except that very, very last one at the very, very last moment when it clearly wasn't going to have a lot of impact. And he spent some political capital weirdly there. But if you go back before him, every president before him since 67 had actually voted yes or supported things in the UN Security Council that he opposed. It was actually an evolution towards Obama being more hardline, just iron wall. No, we will not show any difference with Israel politically. There is no daylight. And some of that is because that's sort of where the lobby went. He was accused before he was even elected of being anti-Israel and he'd be the first president to ever betray Israel's Security Council. That was a narrative that everybody bought. We heard it constantly. We saw it in media. I actually did my research because I found myself saying once, maybe he'll be the first president to vote against Israel at the UN Security Council. And then I thought, wait, that doesn't sound right. This is me thinking facts should matter. And I did this giant database-like project and discovered that not only would he not be the first, he actually, for his first 7.5 years in office, was the first one to veto everything and set a new standard. That's the evolution. I would argue that the evolution, as Noura said, is more honesty, but I would argue it's more than that. There has been a greater sort of arrogance and a greater greed politically to see how much further Congress can go, how much further Congress should be pushed in terms of creating these absolutely unchallengeable entitlements in U.S. policy and law for Israel, where to the point where under Obama and then Biden, and of course now Trump, it's an interesting moment, we see a paradigm of U.S. Israel relations that goes so far beyond anything before that. And it's seen now as the standard that it would be anti-Semitic and anti-Israel to in any way move away from. And that's what's now the profoundly challenges by what Noura was saying, the changes at the grassroots, which are profound and they're bipartisan and they're multi-generational. And also we have a really historic presidency in the sense that this president, no one knows what he'll do and he's not accountable to the normal forces that limit what a president will do. So we don't know.
I want to just shift us geographically, Lara. I want to talk about people like Ben-Gvir for a moment, a person who expresses extreme inflammatory anti-Arab racism. But then we see him being championed for it among legions of followers in Israel. And his hawkish positions on Gaza, the West Bank, and Iran reflect a growing, entrenched ideological current within mainstream Israeli politics. I had mentioned that we all know Americans invested in this space are looking to a change in the current administration to alleviate or create some sort of damage control. How much of the future do you think actually depends on political change inside Israel itself?
It's a heck of a question. I think the first thing to say, and I don't take it for granted that everyone who's paying attention today has been paying attention as long as I have or Noura has. I think it's important to say that Ben-Gvir is not a one-off. It isn't like he suddenly got thrown up by the political moment. Ben-Gvir is part of a trend in Israeli politics that dates back to 48. It certainly dates back to 67. He is a Kahanist. He is in the mode of Rabbi Meir Kahane. You can read Kahane's books. He was an American citizen, a rabbi in New York. This is the undercurrent of just absolute overt dehumanization, racism, Jewish supremacy. I see this in Jewish media, U.S. Jewish media. Jewish supremacy is an anti-Semitic term. I learned this term from Israeli analysts. I learned this is in a proud way, right? This is a proud idea. There's nothing new here. What is new in the current moment is it's more than a decade old. It really dates from the Gaza disengagement and the period where you had a almost rebirth of the normalization of the hardest line racism in Israel. So if you had it before Oslo, this is what I grew up with, Palestinians are terrorists, they're anti-Semites, they're like Nazis. There's just no space at all for the humanization of Palestinians. You then have the Oslo process, and you have a lot of Israelis, many of them I don't think made a huge journey towards humanizing Palestinians, but suspend disbelief. We have this process. At least we have to pretend that we believe this is possible, or pretend, there's negotiations, things are different. The Oslo process is incredibly problematic for many reasons, but one of them is exactly this. It didn't actually change how Israelis feel about Palestinians. And what we saw with the end of the Oslo process, as it was losing all credibility, and as soon as sort of there's a moment, and Gaza disengagement for a lot of people is that moment, you basically have a resurgence of this, let my most racist anti-Palestinian flag fly. And post-October 7th, we saw this instantaneously. I mean, the distance between I'm not a lefty to just turn the place into a parking lot, it was a matter of seconds. And for folks who don't understand how broad-based this is, look at Israeli polls. And I'll remind people, and who knows what will exist in the internet years from now, the fact that Israel today is I would argue, a pariah state. It's not just that it's cringe. Israel has become, for the grassroots internationally, a pariah state, largely because Israel's own soldiers spent months and months live streaming genocide from Gaza. And Israel's own citizens spent months and months live streaming videos of them mocking and showing absolute contempt for Palestinians as they're being genocided. It's unreal. Those of us who'd been following the arc of Israeli politics this whole time, we're not surprised. We were the ones who were saying from October 7th forward, pay attention to the voices that are saying, turn Gaza into a parking lot. These are not marginal voices. Pay attention to the people who are dehumanizing every single Palestinian man, woman, and child. These are not marginal views, and they're not marginal today. Change has to come in Israel before Palestinian lives and rights can be achieved. I've always thought that that was a fantastical notion that was really about kicking the can down the road and avoiding holding Israel accountable for its crimes, holding it for its contempt for international law, holding its contempt for international norms. We have elections coming up in Israel. If Bibi loses, and no one should take that for granted, he is the ultimate survivor. If he loses, whoever replaces him is not going to be more moderate on Palestinians. Maybe the next government will be more rational, moderate on Iran. Maybe. But on Palestinians, there is broad consensus of how do we fight to be more hardline than the other guy. And the only thing that's going to change that is consequences for Israel.
I do want to ask a follow-up question, although I can feel through the screen that Noura has maybe a lot that she would like.
I just want to add a couple notes. I'm so grateful for Lara's analysis and how closely she follows this. I follow as much as possible their Channel 13 and surveys and whatnot. And so I just find it so laughable when folks want to say Israel's not an apartheid state, except if you ask any Israeli, they would be offended if you told them that Palestinians were equal to you. I just find it so laughable that we struggle with is Zionism racism, where the whole ideology is prefaced around the right for Jews to survive above all other people. And first and foremost, Palestinian people. Like genocide now becomes a policy option if that's what makes people feel safe, right? The Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel did a survey, I want to say in 2020. And this is before 2023, okay? Before the October 7 attacks. So I know that there has been a major shift since then, where anybody who was kind of on the line suddenly flipped and saw their lives as mutually exclusive with the ability for Palestinians to survive. So it's okay, just get rid of all of them. Yeah, maybe save some of their lives and move them to other countries, but they can't be here anymore, right? But even in 2020, the survey showed that of the age ranges of who is the most religious, extreme, chauvinist, racist, violent, that survey showed that the most extreme were those aged 18 to 25. That means that Israel's future is even more violent and racist than this present. So for us to then wait on Israelis who literally live in a bubble, who are on the beach, okay? Summertime vibes. As Gaza is being incinerated and families are being incinerated, and they still feel that they are the victims, right? In need of yoga retreats and people's sympathy to support them in genocide. We can't be waiting on them to change the future. And if you want to wait on them to change the future, my God, make it a price for them to pay. But we haven't even exacted a price. And so, you know, this is not new to Palestinians. It's not like the United States had this wake-up moment and said, hey, we really messed up. Black people are human. Why would we enslave them, right? And even blackness is a construct. But like Africans are human. Why would we enslave? Nobody had that moment. It took struggle. It took price, an exacted price. It took an international movement. It didn't even begin in the United States. It was global. Or even to think about juridical equality, right? So for anybody who believes that Israelis need to do something, then make it a heavy price. Make it a heavy price. But the fact of every time we went on television to make an argument of just end the genocide, and the response from these anchors, well, Israel doesn't think it's a genocide. Israel doesn't think it's apartheid. Who cares? Right? And so here, just an emphasis, and I say this because for the listener, I think we tiptoe too much around saying the wrong thing about there's been punishment exacted and people losing their jobs and folks being labeled. And I just want to say this just to emphasize, we're right. We're right. We just have to keep on pushing and make it okay for other people to see that and say that. That's all. And yeah, arrest Ben Gvir when he comes to New York.
Mamdani's town. So, Lara, Noura had mentioned the cost, that we've got to attach a cost. There have to be consequences. What can be done to end, not just curb, but end settler violence? And from your framework, were U.S. sanctions ever enough?
So I appreciate the question, but I'm going to challenge it. Settler violence itself is a problematic framing. Settler violence, which is a term that for many years the Israeli left has really rallied around because it separates the bad guys, like the bad apples, right, from the rest. You know, the settlers are crazy, the settlers are extreme. There really is no distinction between settler violence and state violence. That has always been the reality. Salem, the Israeli Human Rights Group, has been saying that for years. That's been one of their slogans. It is indisputably true from the perspective of Palestinians on the ground. It was true before October 7th. Since October 7th, it is manifestly true because you simply can't tell who is IDF and who is a settler. At this point, they're inextricably linked. The fact is, the settlement movement, since its birth, is an Israeli government project of both the right and the left. Every government in power in Israel, either party, any party, have always supported the settlements. And they've done it financially, they've supported them politically, they've supported them legally. There's an entire area of Israeli law which is basically designed to enable the settlement movement, despite the fact that it's not legal under international law, and much of what they do is illegal even under Israeli law. If you push hard enough that there might be accountability, so we'll change the Israeli law. If necessary, we'll change the entire judicial system. There's simply no distinction. So if we're looking for ways to stop settler violence, that goes back to what does it mean to put real pressure on Israel? The idea that sanctions on individual settlers is going to make a difference, I mean, I get it. It feels good. I'm certainly not someone who opposes singling out a bad person or a bad set of actors or a company that's deeply complicit in international violations of international law. And maybe, let's be clear, maybe 25 years ago, that actually would have meant something, because then it would have been a signal to Israel that it doesn't enjoy impunity and that there will be an escalating set of tactics. And maybe that would have made a difference. Today, it has not made a difference. The Israeli government, much like the U.S. government when it comes to like BDS, the Israeli government basically will use all the tools of government to ensure that those sanctions don't have any impact. And they will essentially treat it as leverage, proving that the world, whoever does this is anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, that it doesn't matter. We have to be looking at real sanctions. Israel is effectively now a pariah state internationally. It is effectively a pariah state for a large part of the U.S. grassroots, the electorate across the country, again, bipartisan, multi-generational. If there is ever a moment to say, what does it look like to put real pressure on Israel? Pressure that can get them to stop committing ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, using settlers and the IDF together as their tool, to stop committing a new genocide and ethnic cleansing in Lebanon, which they're taking the tactics of Gaza. I lived in Lebanon for 2 years. I know Lebanon well. They are erasing parts of Lebanon. If people think that they're going to get out of those areas that they're erasing and not try to keep them completely empty forever, as either to reoccupy with IDF, like they're doing in South Syria now, people are paying attention. It takes real pressure, and real pressure can have impact in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the West Bank. For Palestinian citizens of Israel who have never been treated as full citizens and absolutely are facing the worst crisis of any time since 48, it can affect all those things, but it means actual real pressure. And then the question is, where are those pressure points? And the answer is there are too many to even begin listing here. The U.S. relationship with Israel is so broad and so deep. If there is an intention to actually do real pressure that Israelis will feel and cannot not take into account, the opportunities are just a matter of creativity and a matter of political capital. How much do you want to spend? But going after this sort of thing where you pick out the low-hanging fruit, Jerry Nadler had an amendment offered to a bill, I think last week, on settler violence. I'm sorry, it's too easy. Why are you not having a resolution that calls for U.S. sanctions on Israel if it doesn't let humanitarian goods into Gaza? Like, there are real things you could be doing. This isn't real. I mean, it feels good, and it's the low-hanging fruit, I think, for a lot of the sort of liberal Zionist community, but it's 25 years too late.
Just going to add to that real quick, why these members of Congress that are otherwise stalwart Zionists are moving, because people are moving. Everybody has moved the needle. They're moving to catch up, and they're not catching up enough, and they're just doing enough where they can protect Israel and the status quo without changing anything. Just building on that, I love the breakdown of the lack of distinction, because it's a settler state. The project of it is settlement. Zionism is a race-making project that created a new Jew, right? A new category of not even Israeli, because you have Israeli citizenship, but you're not an Israeli national. But it created this new category of Jewish national that's contingent on territorial accumulation. And there is no territory without dispossessing other people. Let me come to this new section 224 in the National Defense Authorization Act, which folks are referring to as the merger of Israeli and U.S. Military. Now, there's not going to be a merger literally, but what the merger is making more concrete the integration and the cooperation between the U.S. and the Israeli military-industrial complex. It's joint research, it's joint exchange, it's on weapons technologies, the exchange of technologies, military carceral technologies, and weapons. But even that move, we've even heard Netanyahu say it. We can't be dependent on U.S. transfer of weapons. The writing is on the wall. Americans do not want to give Israel their weapons anymore. And so instead, now they're creating other means by which they can say, we're not. There's no transfer. Or this other language. We saw Rahm Emanuel say it recently, the former chief of staff for Obama, who says, yeah, I'm going to run. And I don't think that we need to be giving Israel any more subsidies for weapons anymore. They should just be allowed to buy it. All of this language is a smokescreen. Israel should not be allowed to buy weapons from anyone. It is a genocidal state. And if we needed yet another, we have that in the ICJ decision of 2004 not to advance the wall. We have that in the ICJ decision of July 2024 on the illegality of Israel's presence in the territories. We have that in the plausible genocide of the ICJ, the 3 provisional measures that basically said you cannot enable Israel to continue. And now the UN Commission of Inquiry, the most recent one that said that there is a systematic targeting of children, which is part of a genocidal project. And one of its recommendations to the Security Council is complete sanctions on Israel, no two-way exchange. So just to echo you, Lara, that what they're saying is a smokescreen to maintain the status quo, but nothing less than absolute sanctions in this moment. It's not that Israel should be allowed to buy weapons. They have to be cut off from buying these weapons per law, per morality, per the political tendencies right now.
The place I would like to end us today is more personal in terms of what has the cost of carrying this meant to you? What has stopped you dead in your tracks where you thought that you couldn't get up the next day and do this again? And then what helped you reverse course and say, no, I'm back in the fight, come hell or high water?
The first time I retired from activism, I was a junior in undergraduate in college. And then, I was just like, it's too much. I'm tired, and burnout is a real thing. And it's really hard to figure out how to balance when you care about something so much and it feels like we're in crisis mode, because when is it not a crisis, especially when it has been a crisis? And so I have many times hit rock bottom. And the most recent time that was the hardest was probably in May 2025 when Israel resumed the attacks on Iran. And I thought, this is a slam dunk. Iran restrained from fire the previous November. It's a sovereign state. Its right to self-defense is not in question. Israel has 5 war fronts open. Like, surely people are going to take it to task. And to watch media and pundits basically respond and normalize Israel's attack and to villainize Iran again was when I started to really become deflated that there probably is a secret society that has a suicide pact. And what are we doing on the outside? Now, we've seen the Epstein files. We've learned of, Peter Thiel's gathering of these societies. So maybe that's not far off, but that's really, really deflating. The thing that has eventually got me up and out has been manifold. The most significant has been looking to Palestinians in Gaza who have never surrendered, who've still not surrendered, Palestinian mamas who have continued to make and nurture life, even though there's a direct attack on reproductive genocide and no guarantee of their future. Children who innovate and learn, even though their schools have been destroyed. Palestinians who make music, like Ahmed Abu Amsha, who's turned the hum of drones into songs for children. That, first and foremost, when I look at that and I think, if we have learned nothing in this moment, then we must learn that Palestinians have shown us how to survive, how to fight, how despite 100 years of imperial collusion, they have not been defeated. And so the least I can do in the comfort and the privileges that abound relative to those conditions is to not surrender.
Thank you, Noura. Lara, for the last words on this.
I'm so inspired by what Noura just said. I don't even know what to add. Look, these are incredibly demoralizing times. In terms of a price paid, like with the Jewish community, really whatever. Certainly it has made some things challenging. I remember there was an interview that Mohammed Al-Kurd did. Jewish people saying it's so hard to talk about this at the Shabbat dinner table. And he's like, imagine how hard it is living it. Having the ability to recognize that whatever challenge this poses personally in that sense, it is nothing compared to actually living through this, and you have to stand up for what you believe. I'll say that particularly since October 7th, and everyone I know struggles with just profound demoralization. We've gotten all very good at compartmentalizing. Immediately after October 7th, I would just hit me and everyone I know. You just sort of find yourself crying. It's just absolute, just unbelievable demoralization. I think we all compartmentalize, but when the demoralization becomes too heavy, you look to community and you look to other people who are standing up, and you find strength from that and from people who understand what's going on. And you find strength from knowing that, as Noura said, we're right. There isn't an alternative to standing up. Literal genocide is happening as we speak. It is that there's not an alternative to not try to do something. And frankly, I feel like for me, it's an incredible privilege that I have something to do. So I want to lean into that. I think it'd be far more miserable knowing all this and not doing something and not trying to make a change and at least contribute to what is a positive change at the popular level. I mean, it's extraordinary. And to the fact that, people like me and Noura have an ability to weigh in and bolster that and fuel it. Just like, hey, I've got another database so you can know more, because when you know more, and we are right, it will make you stronger in making your arguments. You don't need to hear from me. They need to hear from you. Don't credit me. Just use the data. That's awesome. It's an incredible privilege, and that strengthens me every day.
I was very privileged to host both of you today. I'm very grateful. Thank you both for bearing witness and for being a part of this conversation.